My girlfriend broke up with me to go back to her ex. 2 years later, she regrets her action. Please take some time and like this video. Also subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. We will be excited to have you join our growing community. She didn't sit down when she came in. She hovered near the doorway instead, one hand resting lightly against the wall, the other gripping her keys so tightly that the metal pressed into her palm, twisting them slowly, absent-mindedly, as though the small, repetitive sound was the only thing anchoring her to the moment, her eyes drifting around my apartment without settling anywhere, as if she was already preparing herself to leave. I watched her for a long moment before speaking, taking in the way her shoulders were tense, the way she kept shifting her weight from one foot to the other, the way her breathing felt just slightly uneven, and I said carefully, "You don't have to stand like you're about to escape. You can sit down if you want." She let out a breath that sounded heavier than it should have and nodded, walking slowly toward the couch. But instead of sitting close like she used to, she chose the far end, placing deliberate distance between us, crossing her legs, folding her hands in her lap, and staring at them like they held the answers she couldn't say out loud. "Can we talk?" she asked finally, her voice softer than usual, almost rehearsed. I gave a slow nod. "I think that's why you came." There was a pause, long enough for the air to grow uncomfortable. Then I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Did you see him?" Her fingers tightened, then loosened again. "Yes," she said quietly, "I ran into him." And I pressed, leaning forward, my elbows resting on my knees, my voice calm even though something inside me had already started bracing for impact. She hesitated, then said, "It brought things back, things I thought I had dealt with." I swallowed slowly. "Things like memories." She shook her head just slightly. "No feelings." The word hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I sat back against the couch, staring at the opposite wall for a second before looking at her again. "Are those feelings stronger than what you feel with me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, slower, like I was giving her all the space in the world to be honest. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally said nothing at all. That silence told me everything. After what felt like a full minute, she whispered, "I don't think I was ready to be in a new relationship when we started." I let out a small, breathless laugh, shaking my head. "So I was the in-between," I said, "the safe place you stayed until your past came knocking." She looked up sharply, hurt flickering across her face. "That's not fair." "Then explain it in a way that is," I replied, my tone steady but tired. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were gathering the courage to say something she had already decided long before she walked through my door. "I want to try again with him," she said. "I need to know for sure." I stood up slowly, pacing a few steps before turning back to her. "So you're choosing the man who already hurt you," I said, "over the one who never did." Her voice cracked. "I'm choosing what feels familiar." I nodded once, the movement automatic. "Familiar doesn't mean healthy." She stood too, clasping her hands together like she was trying to hold herself in place. "You've been good to me," she said softly. "You've been steady, you've been kind, you've never made me doubt where I stand with you." "Then why does it feel like I'm the one being left?" I asked. She looked away. "Because you don't make my heart race the way he does." I smiled sadly. "No," I said, "I make it calm." She hesitated, then said the word that ended everything. "You feel safe." I walked to the door and opened it, resting my hand against the frame. She stared at me, stunned. "You're not even going to fight for us?" I turned back slowly. "I don't fight people who already packed their bags emotionally." She stepped closer, her voice shaking. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I said quietly, "but intention doesn't erase damage." When she left, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt final. When I first met her, she stood almost the same way, guarded, observant, like someone who had learned to read a room before trusting it. I walked up and said, "Hi, I'm Daniel." She studied me for a second, then smiled faintly. "I know." I laughed. "How could you possibly know that?" "You look like a Daniel," she replied, as if that explained everything. Our early conversations stretched late into the night. Long talks about childhood memories, insecurities we rarely admitted out loud, dreams that felt too fragile to announce publicly. One night, sitting in my car while rain streaked across the windshield, she asked, "Do you believe people end up where they're meant to be?" I thought for a moment before answering. "I think people end up where they choose to stay." She nodded slowly. My ex used to believe everything happened for a reason. That name kept surfacing after that, casually, carelessly, like it still lived somewhere inside her. The first time I realized we weren't just friends was in the way she lingered when conversations ended, the way she never rushed to leave, the way she'd look at me after laughing like she was waiting to see if I'd say something else, anything, to keep the moment alive. One evening, we stood outside a cafe after talking for hours, the streetlights buzzing softly above us, cars passing in slow intervals, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, hugging her jacket closer around herself, even though it wasn't cold. She looked at me and said, "So, are we just going to keep standing here pretending we don't want this to last longer?" I smiled, half nervous, half relieved. "I was hoping you'd say that first." She laughed, stepping closer, tilting her head slightly. "I didn't think you were the type to hesitate." "I don't," I said, "unless something actually matters." That was the moment she softened. Not dramatically, just enough to let me in. Our first date wasn't planned. No reservations. No expectations. We walked. That was it. We walked through streets we both pretended we knew well, bumping shoulders occasionally, talking about nothing important and everything real. And at one point she stopped abruptly, turned toward me and said, "You're very present, you know that?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said quickly, smiling. "It's comforting." When I asked her out officially a few days later, she stared at me for a second too long before answering. "Are you serious?" she asked. "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't," I replied. She smiled, wide and unguarded. "Then yes." From that point on, she leaned into us completely. She liked the way I checked in without hovering, the way I listened without interrupting, the way I noticed things she thought no one ever did. One night, lying on my couch with her legs draped across mine, she turned her head toward me and said, "You actually pay attention when I talk." I smiled. "Isn't that the bare minimum?" She shook her head slowly. "Not for everyone." She was happy then, not performative happy, not loud happiness, but the kind that settles into you, that shows up in relaxed shoulders and unforced laughter. We went to the movies often. Not because we loved films more than anyone else, but because she liked the ritual of it, choosing seats, arguing quietly about snacks, whispering commentary she thought I didn't notice, her hands slowly finding mine in the dark, fingers curling like they belonged there. One time, halfway through a movie, she leaned over and whispered, "I don't even care what happens next. I'm just happy sitting here with you." I squeezed her hand and whispered back, "Good, because I already forgot the plot." She laughed, resting her head against my shoulder, and in that moment she felt light, like someone who wasn't carrying the weight of her past. I was careful with her, not because she was fragile, but because I knew she had been hurt in ways she didn't talk about yet. When she had a long day, I'd pull her into my chest and let her talk until the tension left her voice. When she went quiet, I didn't push. When she needed reassurance, I gave it without making her feel small for asking. One evening, she sat across from me at dinner, watching me closely as I spoke, then reached across the table, placed her hand over mine, and said, "You make me feel chosen." I looked at her and replied, "That's because I choose you every day." Her eyes softened. She leaned back in her chair and said, almost to herself, "I forgot relationships could feel like this." She loved how I remembered details, her favorite candy, the way she took her coffee, the songs she played when she couldn't sleep. She loved that I showed up early, that I checked in after meetings, that I didn't disappear emotionally when things got difficult. One night, standing in my kitchen while I cooked, she wrapped her arms around my waist from behind, rested her cheek against my back, and said, "You're good to me, you know that, right?" I turned slightly, covering her hands with mine. "I want to be." She looked up at me. You already are. That was the version of us she later forgot. The version where she smiled more easily. Where she felt safe enough to relax. Where she wasn't chasing intensity, she was experiencing care. And if this were a different kind of story, that would have been enough. But sometimes, people who have lived in chaos mistake peace for something temporary, something they can step away from and return to later. They don't realize that love like this doesn't wait. One evening we were sitting on a couch, a familiar routine, legs tangled, some movie playing that neither of us was actually watching, when I noticed her body wasn't leaning into mine like it always did. Her shoulders angled just slightly away, her eyes fixed on the screen but unfocused, like she was somewhere else entirely. I glanced at her and said lightly, "Hey, you good?" She blinked, startled, like I'd pulled her back from a place she hadn't realized she'd gone. "Yeah, sorry, just tired." I nodded, but something in her voice didn't settle right. A few days later, we were walking through the grocery store, our usual playful arguments over snacks turning into one-sided commentary. And when I reached for her hand, she let me hold it, but her fingers didn't curl back around mine. That night lying in bed, I finally asked, "Have I done something wrong?" She turned onto her side, facing away from me, and said, "No, why would you ask that?" "Because it feels like you're slowly leaving the room while I'm still talking," I replied, choosing my words carefully. She sighed. "You're imagining things." I wanted to believe her. Then one evening, she came home quieter than usual. She placed her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and stood there for a second longer than normal, like she was deciding whether to say something or keep it buried. I watched her and said, "Something happened." She looked at me. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're here," I said gently, "but you're not with me." She sat down slowly and said, "I ran into someone today." I already knew who it was. Still, I asked, "Who?" She hesitated, then said his name. "Her ex." The room felt smaller instantly. I kept my voice calm. "And how did that make you feel?" She rubbed her palms together, staring at them. "I didn't expect it." "That's not an answer," I said quietly. She looked up, her eyes searching mine. "It just reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't thought about in a long time." I nodded slowly. "And did you miss that version?" She didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than her words ever could. Over the next few weeks, he kept appearing. Not physically, emotionally. She'd get messages she didn't show me. She'd smile at her phone, then immediately lock the screen when she noticed me watching. One night while I was brushing my teeth, I heard her pacing the bedroom, whispering into her phone. When I walked in, she ended the call abruptly. "Who was that?" I asked. She shrugged. "Just a friend." I leaned against the doorway. "You don't talk to friends like you're afraid someone might hear." She crossed her arms. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking you to be honest," I said. She looked away. "He reached out, he wanted to check in." "And?" I asked. "And we talked," she said defensively. "That's it." I took a breath. "Do you still have feelings for him?" She answered too quickly. "No." That answer scared me more than silence would have. Her withdrawal wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. She stopped asking how my day was. Stopped laughing at my jokes. Stopped resting her head on my chest when we watched movies. One evening, sitting across from me at dinner, she stared at her plate and said, "Do you ever wonder if we settle for relationships that feel easy because we're afraid of intensity?" I looked up at her. "What kind of intensity?" "The kind that makes you feel alive," she said quietly. I leaned forward. "Do I make you feel numb?" She hesitated. "No, you make me feel calm." There it was again. Calm. The word that sounded like a compliment, but felt like a warning. One night, I finally said, "I feel like I'm losing you slowly, and I don't know how to stop it." She looked at me with tired eyes and replied, "I don't know how to explain what's happening inside me." I nodded. But you do know it involves him. She didn't deny it. Instead, she said, he knows me in ways you don't. I answered softly, that's because you never let me. She swallowed hard. From that point on, she wasn't pulling away, she was drifting. And the hardest part wasn't that she was leaving. It was that she was still standing right in front of me while she did it. Somehow, I didn't understand it at first. From my side, everything made sense. I was consistent, present, attentive, emotionally available in ways she herself used to say she had never experienced before. So when she began pulling away, my instinct wasn't anger, it was confusion, because nothing about us had broken yet. One night, after another long silence that stretched between us like a third person on the couch, I finally said, help me understand something, because right now it feels like I'm being punished for treating you well. She looked at me slowly, as if the sentence landed somewhere uncomfortable. I'm not punishing you, she said. I just feel restless. Restless how? I asked. Like something's missing or like something's wrong. She leaned back, folded her arms, stared at the ceiling, and after a long pause said, I don't know how to explain it without sounding ungrateful. I moved closer, lowering my voice. Try anyway. She sighed. With him, she said quietly, everything was unpredictable. I waited. There were highs, she continued, really intense ones where I felt chosen, desired, like I had to earn his attention, and when I got it, it felt incredible. I swallowed. And the lows. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. The lows were awful, silence, fights, uncertainty, feeling like I could lose him at any moment. I nodded slowly. And with me. She hesitated. With you, I never feel like I'm about to lose you. I looked at her and said something that came from instinct more than thought. That's not a flaw, that's safety. She shook her head, frustrated. I know that logically, but emotionally my body doesn't respond the same way. That was the first time I realized this wasn't about love, it was about conditioning. Another night, lying in bed with our backs to each other, she suddenly said, do you ever feel like something's too easy to be real? I turned toward her. Do you think peace means it's fake? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, when I was with him, I was always alert, always anticipating the next mood shift, always trying to stay one step ahead. And that felt like love to you? I asked. She closed her eyes. It felt familiar. That word again. Familiar. I sat up slightly and said, familiar doesn't mean healthy, it just means you learned how to survive in it. She didn't argue, because deep down she knew. One evening, after she had spoken to her ex again, she admitted something that changed how I saw everything. I don't know who I am in a relationship where I'm not fighting for my place, she said quietly. I looked at her and replied, you don't have to fight here, you're already chosen. She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. That's the problem, I don't know how to relax inside that. And suddenly, all the pieces aligned. She didn't confuse chaos with love because she wanted pain. She confused chaos with love because chaos was the environment where she learned connection. Uncertainty had trained her nervous system. Inconsistency had sharpened her emotions. Validation that came and went had wired her to crave the chase. So when she met someone who didn't disappear, didn't manipulate, didn't make affection conditional, her body didn't register excitement. It registered unfamiliar territory. One night, in one of our last real conversations, I said, do you think you're bored, or do you think you're finally calm for the first time in your life? She stared at me for a long time before answering. I think calm feels empty when you're used to noise. I nodded slowly. And noise feels exciting when you don't know peace. Her ex represented unpredictability. I represented stability. And instead of seeing stability as growth, her instincts treated it like a threat. Not because she didn't care, but because her nervous system hadn't learned how to rest. The tragedy wasn't that she went back to him. The tragedy was that she mistook healing for stagnation and self-sabotage for passion. And by the time she realized the difference, She had already walked away from the one place she didn't have to perform to be loved. The night it ended didn't announce itself. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No dramatic ultimatums. Just a silence that felt heavier than any argument we'd ever avoided. She sat across from me on the couch, knees pulled up slightly, hands folded together in her lap like she was waiting for bad news she already knew was coming. She kept rubbing her thumb against her fingernail, over and over, not looking at me, not quite ready to say the thing that had been growing between us for weeks. I watched her closely, the way her shoulders stayed tense, the way her breathing was shallow, the way she leaned forward as if she might leave at any second, and I realized something that hurt more than anything else. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of staying. I broke the silence first. "You don't sit like that unless you've already decided something," I said softly. She looked up, eyes glassy but steady. "I didn't want to hurt you." I nodded. "I know, but you're hurting me anyway by not being honest." She swallowed, then said it, not dramatically, not cruelly, just tired. "I've been talking to him again." The room didn't spin. My heart didn't race. What I felt was recognition. "I know," I replied. She frowned slightly. "How?" "Because you've been leaving long before tonight," I said. "Your body's been here, but your mind's been somewhere else." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't plan for this to happen." "I believe you," I said, "but intention doesn't change impact." She nodded, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "I feel torn." I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said, "No, you feel pulled. Torn is when you want both. Pulled is when one direction already has your attention." She looked at me then, really looked, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in weeks. "I care about you," she said quickly. "You've been good to me. You've been everything I didn't know I needed." I met her eyes and replied, "And still not what you choose." That sentence landed harder than anything else I could have said. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I continued, my voice calm but firm. "I won't compete with chaos. I won't beg someone to stay when their heart is already negotiating an exit." She stood up slowly, pacing a few steps before turning back to me. "I'm not saying I don't love you." I shook my head gently. Love isn't just a feeling. It's a decision you make when it would be easier not to. She stopped moving. The room felt small then. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. I stood up too, closing the distance between us, not touching her, just standing close enough that she could feel the truth of what I was about to say. "You already are," I said quietly, "because I won't stay where I'm an option." Her face crumpled. "I'm scared," she admitted. "With you everything feels final, safe, like there's no drama to hide behind." I nodded. "That's called peace, and I'm sorry it scares you." She reached for my arm instinctively, then stopped herself halfway, fingers hovering in the air like she didn't have permission anymore. "I don't know how to be in something this calm," she said. I took a breath and said the hardest thing I've ever said to someone I loved. "Then I can't be the one you learn on." Her eyes widened. "You're just letting me go." I looked at her with a sadness that had nothing left to prove. "No," I said, "I'm choosing myself." There was a long pause. Then she nodded slowly, like someone finally accepting the weight of their own choice. "I think I need to leave," she said. I stepped aside, clearing a path without drama, without bitterness. She walked toward the door, stopped, turned back one last time. "I hope you know," she said, voice breaking, "that this isn't because you weren't enough." I met her gaze and replied, "I know it's because I was." She stood there for a second longer, then opened the door and stepped out. When it closed behind her, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt still. And for the first time since she began pulling away, I wasn't confused anymore. I was free. After she left, my life didn't improve overnight. There was no sudden clarity, no cinematic relief, no sense of victory waiting on the other side of the door she closed behind her. There was just silence. The kind of silence that forces you to confront yourself without distraction. The first few weeks were mechanical. I woke up, made the bed, went to work, came home, ate meals I barely tasted, and sat in rooms that still carried the outline of her presence. The faint indentation on the couch, the extra mug in the cupboard, the space beside me that stayed empty long after I stopped expecting it not to be. I didn't post quotes. I didn't announce healing. I didn't tell people I was doing great. I just kept going. Some nights I'd sit alone and replay conversations, not to torture myself, but to understand them, and every time I reached the same conclusion. I hadn't been careless with love. I had been intentional, and that mattered. So I turned inward. I started waking up earlier, not because I was motivated, but because sleep came lightly now, and instead of fighting it, I used the hours. I read. I worked. I trained. I poured the energy I used to spend reassuring someone else into building a version of myself that didn't need to be chosen to feel whole. No one clapped for that part. No one noticed. And that was the point. Meanwhile, she returned to noise. At first, it looked like relief. She told herself the familiar tension meant passion, that the emotional spikes meant depth, that the uncertainty meant she was alive again. She leaned into the intensity like it was proof she had made the right choice. But intensity is expensive. And eventually, the bill comes due. She'd message me occasionally in those early months. Nothing explicit, nothing brave. "How are you? I drove past that cafe today. Hope you're doing okay." I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Out of respect for the boundary I had drawn the night I let her go. As time passed, her messages changed tone. Less nostalgia. More restlessness. I feel like I'm always on edge. I don't know why I'm tired all the time. I thought things would feel different. By then, my life had settled into a rhythm she no longer recognized. I had moved. Not far, just enough to mark a new chapter. I had new routines, new goals, quieter confidence. I laughed more easily again. She, on the other hand, began to fray. The chaos she had mistaken for love didn't soften with time, it sharpened. Arguments returned. Disappearances returned. The constant feeling of auditioning for affection returned. And one night, years later, she finally said out loud what her body had known all along. "This shouldn't feel this hard," she told a friend, staring at her phone, waiting for a reply that didn't come. That's when regret entered. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a realization that seeps in when denial gets tired. She started comparing. Not because she wanted to, but because memory doesn't ask permission. She remembered how I used to listen without scrolling, how I noticed shifts in her tone, how I stayed present even when there was nothing to gain. She remembered how calm used to feel boring and how exhausting chaos had become. One night, she typed a long message to me. Pages of reflection. Apologies carefully worded. Admissions she would never made before. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she erased it. Because by then, she understood something painful and irreversible. I hadn't been rebuilding to return. I had been rebuilding to move on. When we finally crossed paths again, briefly, unexpectedly, she looked at me like someone seeing a familiar place that no longer belonged to them. "You seem different," she said. I smiled politely. "Different isn't the word," I replied. "I'm just not unfinished anymore." She nodded, forcing a smile, and said quietly, "I think I made a mistake." I looked at her with empathy, not longing, and answered honestly. "No," I said, "you made a choice, and you learned from it." That was the moment it settled in for her. Not everyone you lose is meant to be reclaimed. Some people are lessons you only understand after it's too late. I walked away that day without anger, without bitterness, without the need to be understood. And behind me, she stood still, not because she wanted to chase me, but because she finally realized she had once been loved in a way that asked for nothing but presence. And she had mistaken it for something she could afford to lose. Weeks came and passed. I would read a detailed email she sent to me, which read, "I used to tell myself that I didn't leave because I wanted chaos. I told myself I left because I needed passion, because something felt missing, because love was supposed to feel louder than it did with you. But sitting here now, with my phone face down on the table and the room too quiet for distractions, I can finally admit the truth to myself. I didn't know how to stay where I didn't have to fight. With you, nothing was on the line, and somehow that terrified me more than losing myself ever had. You chose me so easily that I didn't know what role to play anymore. I didn't have to impress you or chase you or anticipate your moods, and instead of feeling relieved, I felt exposed, like without the struggle I had no proof that I mattered. I remember the night you asked me if I was bored or just calm, and I laughed it off because the answer felt dangerous. I was calm, and I didn't trust it. I went back to what I understood, the tension, the unpredictability, the constant feeling that love could disappear at any moment if I didn't perform well enough. At first it felt familiar, even exciting, like slipping back into an old language. My body still spoke fluently. But familiar doesn't mean right. And eventually, the noise stopped sounding like passion and started sounding like exhaustion. I started missing things I never thought I would. The way you listened without trying to fix me. The way you noticed when I was quiet before I said anything. The way your affection didn't come with conditions. I miss how safe it felt to be ordinary with you. With him, I'm always alert. With you, I could rest. And I didn't understand how rare that was until rest became something I couldn't find anywhere else. I used to think love had to hurt a little to be real. Now I realize pain just felt convincing because it demanded my attention. You never demanded anything. You offered, and I mistook that for something replaceable. Sometimes I replay the night you let me go, not because I want to argue with it, but because I finally understand what you meant when you said you wouldn't compete with chaos. You weren't giving up on me. You were refusing to abandon yourself. And that kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It just leaves quietly and never looks back. I wonder if you know how often I think about you now. Not in the dramatic way people imagine, not in a comeback kind of longing, but in the quiet moments when I realize how rare it is to be loved without fear. I see now that you didn't lose me. I lost you. And the hardest part isn't that you moved on. It's that you grew, while I stayed trying to make noise feel like meaning. If I could speak to the version of me who left, I wouldn't tell her to stay. I'd tell her to learn what peace looks like before she mistakes it for emptiness. Because some people only recognize real love after they've traded it for something louder. And by then, the silence they fear is the only thing left. And if you ever wonder whether you mattered to me, you did. Just not in time. If you found this story interesting, please remember to like this video and hit the subscribe button. Also turn on the notifications so you don't miss out on any of our amazing videos. And lastly, endeavor to share this video with your friends. Thank you and see you in the next video.